The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Eldoria Palace as servants hurried through the corridors, their footsteps echoing in the vast hallways. King Theodore sat in his private study, staring at a portrait that had become both his greatest treasure and his most dangerous secret. The painting depicted a young woman with auburn hair and emerald eyes, her smile captured in oil paints that seemed to breathe with life. This was Elara Winters, and her story would shake the very foundations of the kingdom. Theodore had not always been a king burdened by impossible choices. 3 years earlier, he had been a prince known for his adventurous spirit and genuine care for his people. Unlike many royals who remained sheltered within palace walls, Theodore often ventured into the villages and towns of Eldoria, sometimes in disguise, to better understand the lives of those he would one day rule. It was during one such journey that fate intervened in the most unexpected way. The small coastal town of Millhaven had been struggling with a series of storms that damaged fishing boats and flooded homes. Theodore arrived there on a gray October morning, dressed as a traveling merchant, with only his trusted guard Marcus accompanying him in similar disguise. The prince wanted to see firsthand the damage and determine what aid the crown could provide without the usual ceremony and preparation that official visits required. As Theodore walked through the town square, he noticed a small crowd gathered around a young woman who was distributing bread and warm soup to families affected by the storms. She moved with a grace that caught his attention, but it was her genuine compassion that truly captivated him. When an elderly man struggled to carry his portion, she immediately helped him to a nearby bench and sat with him while he ate, listening intently to his stories about the old days. Elara Winters was 23 years old, the daughter of a local baker who had died the previous winter. She had inherited not only his modest bakery, but also his generous heart. Despite her own financial struggles, she had used most of her savings to provide food for storm victims, believing that community support was more valuable than personal wealth. Her auburn hair was simply braided, and her green wool dress had been mended several times, yet Theodore found her more beautiful than any duchess he had ever met at court. When Theodore approached the food distribution line, Elara looked up at him with those remarkable emerald eyes and smiled. "You must be new to Millhaven," she said warmly, ladling soup into a wooden bowl. "I haven't seen you around before. Were you caught in the storms as well?" Theodore found himself momentarily speechless. He had attended countless royal functions where people approached him with careful calculation, their words measured and their smiles practiced. But Elara spoke to him as simply another human being in need, with no hidden agenda or desire for favor. "I'm a traveling merchant," he managed to say, accepting the bowl gratefully. "I heard about the damage and wanted to see if there was anything I could do to help." Her face lit up with genuine appreciation. "That's wonderful. We can always use extra hands. If you're planning to stay in town for a few days, perhaps you could help us repair some of the damaged fishing nets?" Many of the fishermen are too proud to ask for assistance directly, but if you just happen to be working nearby, she let the suggestion hang in the air with a knowing smile that suggested she understood the delicate nature of offering help to independent people. Theodore found himself agreeing immediately, though he had never repaired a fishing net in his life. Marcus shot him a worried look from across the square, but Theodore ignored it. For the first time in his adult life, he felt truly useful rather than merely ceremonial. That afternoon, he sat by the harbor with several local men, learning to weave new sections into damaged nets while listening to their stories about life on the sea. Elara appeared beside him just as he was struggling with a particularly complex knot. "Here, let me show you," she said, her fingers brushing against his as she guided his hands through the proper technique. The simple touch sent an unexpected jolt through Theodore, and he found himself studying her profile as she concentrated on the repair work. Her brow furrowed slightly when she focused, and she had a habit of tucking a stray strand of hair behind her ear when she was thinking. Over the next 3 days, Theodore threw himself into helping the town recover. He learned to patch roof thatch, rebuild stone walls damaged by floodwater, and even helped Elara bake bread for the continued relief efforts. Each evening, the volunteers would gather at the local tavern to share a simple meal and discuss the next day's work. Theodore found these conversations more engaging than any diplomatic dinner he had ever attended. Elara fascinated him with her combination of practical wisdom and gentle humor. She could calculate precisely how much flour would be needed to feed a family of 6 for a week, negotiate with suppliers to get the best price for materials, and settle disputes between workers with a few well-chosen words. Yet she also had a playful side that emerged in quiet moments. She would make amusing observations about the local personalities, tell stories about her father's misadventures in the bakery, and sing old folk songs while they worked. On his final evening in Millhaven, Theodore found himself walking alone with Elara along the harbor wall. The sea had calmed after the storms, and moonlight danced on the gentle waves. They sat on a stone bench overlooking the water, and for a while neither spoke, simply enjoying the peaceful moment after days of intense work. "I'm glad you came to Millhaven," Elara said finally. "Not just for the help, though that was wonderful. It's rare to meet someone who understands that real satisfaction comes from making things better for other people." Theodore turned to look at her, struck by how perfectly she had articulated something he had always felt but never expressed. "I've spent most of my life surrounded by people who measure success by what they can gain," he said carefully. "Being here, working alongside everyone, it feels more real than anything I've experienced before." Elara smiled and reached over to squeeze his hand. "You have a good heart. Don't let the world change that." She stood up then, smoothing her skirts. "I should head home. Early morning at the bakery tomorrow." As she walked away, Theodore felt a profound sense of loss that surprised him with its intensity. He had known this remarkable woman for only 3 days, yet the thought of never seeing her again felt unbearable. That night, he lay awake in the small inn room, staring at the ceiling and trying to understand what was happening to him. Marcus found him the next morning already dressed and pacing by the window. "Your Highness, we need to return to the capital today. Your father expects you back for the treaty negotiations with Astoria." Theodore nodded absently, but as they prepared to leave Millhaven, he made an impulsive decision that would change everything. Instead of departing immediately, he sought out Elara at her bakery. She was kneading dough when he entered, flour dusting her forearms, and a look of pleasant concentration on her face. "I wanted to say goodbye properly," he said, suddenly feeling awkward. In the palace, he always knew exactly what to say and how to behave, but with Elara, his usual royal composure seemed to desert him. She looked up with genuine pleasure. "I'm so glad you came by. I was hoping to give you something." She wiped her hands on her apron and disappeared into the back room, returning with a small loaf of bread wrapped in a clean cloth. "For your journey. It's my father's recipe for honey wheat bread. He always said good food makes any road easier to travel." Theodore accepted the gift, their fingers brushing again as he took the wrapped loaf. The simple gesture meant more to him than the most elaborate royal presents he had ever received. "Thank you," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "For everything. These have been the best 3 days of my life." Something in his tone must have conveyed the depth of his feeling, because Elara's expression grew more serious. She studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to solve a puzzle. "Will I see you again?" she asked quietly. Theodore wanted desperately to say yes, but he knew the complications that would bring. A traveling merchant might return to Millhaven someday, but Prince Theodore had responsibilities that would likely keep him far from this small coastal town. "I hope so," he said finally, which was both completely honest and utterly inadequate. The journey back to the capital felt interminable. Marcus, who had served as Theodore's guard for 5 years, recognized his prince's unusual mood and wisely remained silent for most of the ride. It was only when they stopped to rest their horses that he finally spoke. "Your Highness, forgive my presumption, but I've never seen you quite like this before." Theodore leaned against a fence post and stared across the rolling hills toward the distant palace spires. "She's extraordinary, Marcus. Not because of her beauty, though she is beautiful, but because of how she sees the world, how she treats people. When I was with her, I felt like the person I've always wanted to be. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. She seemed like a remarkable woman. But, Your Highness, you know that. That I can never see her again, Theodore finished bitterly. That my marriage will be arranged to strengthen political alliances, not because of any personal preference. Yes, Marcus, I know exactly what my future holds. But knowing his duty and accepting it proved to be very different things. Back at the palace, Theodore found himself distracted during meetings, irritable with courtiers, and unable to concentrate on the matters of state that had always interested him before. He kept Elara's bread in his private chambers, saving the last few pieces long after they had grown stale, simply because they were a tangible connection to those 3 perfect days in Millhaven. King Frederick noticed his son's changed demeanor immediately. You seem troubled, Theodore. The Millhaven relief mission was successful, I trust. Yes, father. The town is recovering well. Theodore kept his voice neutral, but his father's sharp eyes missed nothing. Good. I'm glad to hear it. These direct interventions can be valuable, though they must be balanced with broader diplomatic concerns. Frederick paused meaningfully. Speaking of which, I've received a very promising proposal from Narinia. Princess Isabel would make an excellent queen consort, and the alliance would strengthen our eastern borders considerably. Theodore's heart sank, though he showed no outward reaction. Princess Isabel was beautiful, intelligent, and politically astute. She would indeed make an excellent queen, and their marriage would benefit both kingdoms. The fact that he felt no emotional connection to her was irrelevant in the world of royal marriages. When would you like to meet with the Narinian delegation? He asked dutifully. Next month. We'll need time to prepare the proper ceremonies and negotiate the detailed terms. Frederick studied his son's face. You don't seem enthusiastic about this prospect. I understand my responsibilities, father. My personal preferences are secondary to the needs of the kingdom. Frederick's expression softened slightly. I know this is not easy, son, but duty and personal happiness are not always compatible for those of us born to rule. You'll find that shared purpose and mutual respect can grow into something quite meaningful over time. Theodore nodded and excused himself, but as he walked through the palace corridors, his father's words rang hollow. He had experienced something far beyond mutual respect in those 3 days with Elara. He had felt understood, valued for himself rather than his title, and completely at peace with who he was. The thought of never experiencing that feeling again made his future feel like an elaborately decorated prison. That evening, Theodore sat in his study and began composing a letter. He wrote it carefully, choosing each word with precision, explaining nothing directly, but conveying everything important. He sealed it with his personal signet rather than the royal seal, and gave it to Marcus with specific instructions. Take this to Millhaven personally. Give it to Elara Winters, and wait for her response if she chooses to write one. Tell no one about this journey, and if anyone asks, you were visiting your cousin in the northern provinces. Marcus accepted the letter without question, though his expression suggested he understood the dangerous territory his prince was entering. And if there's a response, Your Highness, bring it to me immediately, regardless of the hour or circumstances. 2 weeks later, Marcus returned with a letter written on simple paper in Elara's careful handwriting. Theodore dismissed his other attendants and opened it with hands that trembled slightly. Her words were warm but careful, expressing pleasure at hearing from her traveling merchant friend and sharing news of Millhaven's continued recovery. She mentioned that several families had asked about him, hoping he might return someday to see how well their repairs had held up through the autumn weather. The letter was perfectly innocent on the surface, but Theodore could read the deeper meaning in every carefully chosen phrase. She had not forgotten him either. Thus began a correspondence that would span nearly 2 years and change the course of 2 kingdoms. Theodore found ways to send letters through various intermediaries, always maintaining the fiction that he was simply a merchant with business interests that kept him traveling. Elara wrote back with increasing openness, sharing her thoughts about everything from local politics to philosophy to her dreams for expanding her father's bakery into a larger enterprise that could employ more of the town's women. Theodore found himself eagerly anticipating each letter, reading them multiple times and keeping them in a locked box in his private chambers. Through their written exchanges, he came to know Elara's mind as well as her heart. She was far more educated than her humble circumstances might suggest, having borrowed books from the local priest and taught herself history, literature, and even some basic mathematics for her business accounts. More importantly, she shared Theodore's vision of leadership as service rather than privilege. In one letter, she wrote about organizing the fishermen's wives to create a cooperative fund for boat repairs, explaining her belief that communities grew stronger when people pooled their resources rather than competing with each other. Theodore found her insights more valuable than those of his most experienced advisors. Meanwhile, the arrangements for his marriage to Princess Isabel proceeded inexorably forward. Theodore participated in all the necessary negotiations and ceremonies, but his heart remained completely detached from the process. He treated Isabel with perfect courtesy during their formal meetings, and she reciprocated with equal politeness, but both of them understood they were players in a larger political drama rather than participants in a romance. The crisis came when Theodore could no longer bear the pretense. 18 months after that first visit to Millhaven, he found an excuse to return there on official crown business, ostensibly to inspect the coastal defenses and assess the town's strategic value. This time he traveled openly as Prince Theodore, with a full royal escort, and all the ceremony such a visit required. Elara learned of the prince's impending arrival along with the rest of the town. She spent the day before his visit in a state of nervous confusion, suddenly understanding why her traveling merchant friend had seemed so educated, so worldly, so different from other men she had known. When she saw the royal procession enter Millhaven's town square and recognized the face she had come to love beneath the prince's ceremonial crown, her world shifted completely. Theodore spotted her in the crowd immediately, though she tried to remain inconspicuous near the back of the assembled townspeople. Their eyes met across the square, and the electric connection between them was as powerful as ever, despite the changed circumstances. He conducted his official business with appropriate royal dignity, but every moment felt like an elaborate performance designed to delay the only conversation that truly mattered. That evening, after the formal ceremonies concluded, Theodore managed to slip away from his guards and meet Elara at the harbor wall, where they had sat together that first magical evening. She was waiting for him, though she looked uncertain and perhaps a little afraid. "Your Highness," she said formally, offering a proper curtsy. "Please," Theodore said quickly, reaching for her hands. "I'm still the same person you knew. My feelings haven't changed because of a title." Elara looked down at their joined hands, her expression conflicted. "But everything else has changed. You're going to be king. You're already engaged to Princess Isabel. What I thought we had, it was built on a lie." "No," Theodore said fiercely. "It was the only honest thing in my life. When I was with you, I could be myself completely. Everything else is the lie. The ceremonies, the political marriages, the pretense that duty and happiness are the same thing." Elara pulled her hands free and walked to the harbor's edge, staring out at the dark water. "What are you saying? That you want to continue this correspondence? That you want me to wait while you marry another woman and hope for stolen moments between your royal obligations?" Theodore joined her at the water's edge, his heart breaking at the pain in her voice. "I don't know what I'm saying. I only know that I love you, and the thought of a future without you feels impossible to bear." She turned to face him then, tears glittering in the moonlight. "I love you too. I think I started falling in love with you that first day, when you sat with old Henrik and listened to his stories like they were the most important thing in the world. But love isn't enough, is it? You have a responsibility to your kingdom, and I won't be the person who asks you to abandon that." They stood there in silence for a long time, both understanding that they faced an impossible situation. Finally, Elara spoke again, her voice steady despite her tears. There's something you should know. I'm going to leave Millhaven soon. There's an opportunity to manage a larger bakery in the capital city of Narinia. It's a chance to build something bigger than what I could ever accomplish here. Theodore felt as though the ground had shifted beneath his feet. Narinia? But that's where Princess Isabel is from. Yes, I know. Elara's smile was sad but determined. Perhaps it's better this way. A clean break, new opportunities for both of us. You can focus on your royal duties without distractions, and I can build the life I've always dreamed of. I can't bear the thought of you, so close yet so far away, Theodore said desperately. And I can't bear the thought of living in the shadow of what might have been, Elara replied gently. This way, we each have a chance to find happiness in our own spheres. Before Theodore could respond, she rose on her tiptoes and kissed him softly, a goodbye that contained all the love and sorrow neither could fully express in words. Then she walked away, leaving him alone with the sound of waves against the harbor wall and the weight of his impossible choices. Theodore returned to the palace knowing that his life had irrevocably changed. He could no longer pretend that his arranged marriage was simply a diplomatic necessity that didn't affect his personal happiness. He now knew exactly what he was sacrificing, and the knowledge made every royal obligation feel like a betrayal of his authentic self. But he also understood Elara's wisdom in leaving Millhaven. As long as she remained there, he would never be able to fully commit to his royal duties. Her absence might break his heart, but it would also free him to become the king his people deserved, even if that king would forever carry the secret sorrow of lost love. 2 years passed like a slow dream filled with duty and ceremony. King Frederick died peacefully in his sleep, and Theodore ascended to the throne at age 28, carrying the weight of a crown he had always known would be his but now felt heavier than ever. His marriage to Princess Isabel had proceeded as planned, a magnificent ceremony attended by dignitaries from across the continent. She proved to be everything the diplomatic negotiations had promised: intelligent, graceful, and utterly committed to her role as queen consort. Yet Theodore found himself thinking of Elara every morning when he woke, and every evening before sleep claimed him. He had kept her letters hidden in a secret compartment of his desk, and sometimes in moments of weakness, he would read them again, remembering the woman who had seen his soul and loved it completely. Marcus, now captain of the Royal Guard, occasionally brought news from his travels, mentioning that Elara had indeed prospered in Narinia, building a successful chain of bakeries that employed dozens of women and had gained recognition even among the nobility. She's become quite influential, Marcus reported one evening as he delivered routine security briefings. The Narinian court speaks highly of her business acumen and charitable work. She's opened a school for merchants' daughters, teaching them mathematics and letters alongside traditional domestic skills. Theodore absorbed this information with mixed emotions. He felt proud of Elara's success and grateful that she had found purpose and prosperity, but he also experienced a sharp pang of loss, knowing that her life was flourishing in ways he could never be part of. Has she married? He asked, trying to keep his voice casual. Marcus shook his head. No, Your Majesty. From what I understand, she's focused entirely on her enterprises. There have been suitors, of course, but she's declined all offers. This information brought Theodore both relief and guilt. He hated to think that Elara might be avoiding marriage because of their lost love, yet he couldn't deny his own selfish happiness that she remained unattached. His relationship with Queen Isabel had settled into a pattern of mutual respect and formal affection. They worked well together on state matters, and she had proven to be a valuable advisor with keen insights into international politics. But there was no passion between them, no moments of spontaneous laughter, no deep conversations that lasted until dawn. Their interactions remained courteous and productive, like a well-functioning business partnership. Isabel seemed content with this arrangement, having grown up understanding that royal marriages serve political rather than romantic purposes. Sometimes Theodore wondered if she sensed his emotional distance, and simply chose not to address it, considering their public success more important than private intimacy. The crisis that would shatter this careful equilibrium began with what should have been wonderful news. After 3 years of marriage, Queen Isabel announced that she was expecting their first child. The kingdom rejoiced, and Theodore felt a genuine surge of anticipation at the prospect of becoming a father. Perhaps, he thought, a child would finally bridge the emotional gap between him and his wife, giving them the shared love and purpose their marriage had always lacked. But Isabel's pregnancy proved difficult from the beginning. She suffered from severe morning sickness that lasted well beyond the usual time frame, followed by complications that required her to remain bedridden for weeks at a time. The royal physicians assured Theodore that such difficulties were not uncommon, especially for first pregnancies, but their careful optimism couldn't mask their underlying concern. During this period, Theodore found himself managing many of Queen Isabel's usual responsibilities in addition to his own. He threw himself into the work with determination, hoping that exhaustion might quiet the restless longing that still haunted his quieter moments. It was while reviewing trade agreements with Narinia that he encountered a name that stopped his heart. Elara Winters was listed as the primary supplier for the royal household's baked goods. Theodore stared at the document for a long time, his mind racing with possibilities and complications. She was closer than she had ever been during their separation, yet still impossibly distant. He found himself wondering if she knew about his involvement in approving these contracts, if she ever thought about their lost love while conducting business with his kingdom. The temptation to arrange a meeting was overwhelming, but Theodore resisted it for months. He had duties to his pregnant wife, responsibilities to both kingdoms involved in the trade agreement, and obligations to maintain the political stability that depended on his marriage's success. But as Isabel's condition worsened and she grew increasingly withdrawn, Theodore felt his emotional reserves depleting. The breaking point came during a particularly difficult evening in Isabel's 7th month. She had suffered another episode of severe pain that left her weak and frightened. The royal physicians whispered among themselves about the possibility of losing either mother or child, though they tried to maintain optimistic facades when speaking directly to the king and queen. Theodore sat by Isabel's bedside, holding her pale hand and trying to offer comfort, but his own fear and helplessness were overwhelming. For the first time in their marriage, Isabel seemed to see past his royal composure to the struggling man beneath. "You're afraid," she said softly, her voice weak but perceptive. "Of course I'm afraid," Theodore replied honestly. "For you, for our child, for what all of this means." Isabel studied his face in the candlelight, and something shifted in her expression. "There's something else, isn't there? Something that's been troubling you long before this pregnancy began." Theodore hesitated, unwilling to burden his suffering wife with confessions about his lost love, but Isabel's direct gaze demanded honesty. "There are aspects of my past that make current circumstances more difficult," he said carefully. "You're in love with someone else," Isabel said without accusation, simply stating a fact she had apparently understood for some time. The blunt words hung in the air between them like a confession and a revelation simultaneously. Theodore wanted to deny it, to protect both their feelings with diplomatic language, but Isabel deserved better than more careful pretense. "Yes," he said simply, "I am sorry." To his surprise, Isabel smiled sadly rather than showing anger or hurt. "I've known since our wedding day. You're too good a man to be deliberately cruel, but you're too honest to fake emotions you don't feel. I had hoped that time and shared purpose might change things between us." "Isabel," Theodore began, but she squeezed his hand weakly. "I'm not angry," she said. "Disappointed, perhaps, but not angry. We both knew what this marriage was when we agreed to it. I had simply hoped we might find something more along the way." They sat in silence for a while, finally, acknowledging the truth that had shaped their entire relationship. When Isabel spoke again, her words surprised Theodore completely. "I think you should see her," she said quietly. "What?" "This woman you love. Our child may not survive, and if something happens to me as well, you'll carry guilt and regret for the rest of your life. But if we both survive this ordeal, we'll need to find a way to build something real together. And that can't happen while you're haunted by what might have been. Theodore stared at his wife in amazement. Even in her weakened state, struggling with a dangerous pregnancy, she was offering him a kind of understanding he had never expected. I can't leave you now. Not while you're... Marcus can arrange it discreetly, Isabel interrupted. A quick trip to review the Nerinian trade agreements. You could be back within a week. The proposal was both tempting and terrifying. Theodore knew that seeing Elara again might provide the closure his heart desperately needed, but it also might reopen wounds that had begun to heal. What if seeing her only makes things worse? Then, at least you'll know, Isabel said with gentle wisdom. Uncertainty is often more painful than difficult truths. 3 days later, Theodore found himself traveling toward Nerinia with a small delegation, ostensibly to finalize trade negotiations, but actually to confront the love he had tried to bury beneath royal duty. Marcus had arranged everything with his usual discretion, and the Nerinian court welcomed their visitors with appropriate ceremony. Elara's bakery occupied an elegant building in the capital's merchant quarter, its windows displaying an array of breads and pastries that drew steady streams of customers throughout the day. Theodore watched from across the street for nearly an hour before gathering the courage to enter, studying Elara through the glass as she worked with focused intensity. She had changed in subtle ways during their separation. Her auburn hair was now arranged in a more sophisticated style befitting her elevated station, and her clothing reflected her business success with fine fabrics and careful tailoring. But her smile remained exactly as Theodore remembered it, warm and genuine as she interacted with customers and employees alike. When Theodore finally entered the bakery, dressed in the simple traveling clothes Marcus had provided, Elara was arranging fresh loaves on display, shelves with her back to the door. She turned at the sound of footsteps, and her face went through a series of rapid expressions: surprise, joy, confusion, and something that might have been pain. "Your Majesty," she said formally, offering a proper curtsy despite the intimate setting. "Please," Theodore said, using the same words he had spoken at their last meeting. "I'm still the same person." Elara glanced around the busy bakery, where several customers and employees were beginning to take notice of the conversation. "Perhaps we should speak privately," she suggested, leading him through a doorway into a small office behind the main shop. The office reflected Elara's practical nature and business success. Account books were neatly organized on shelves, correspondence sorted in label boxes, and a large map of the region marked with delivery routes and supplier locations covered one wall. But Theodore's attention was immediately drawn to a small easel in the corner, holding a half-finished painting of the harbor at Millhaven. "You still paint," he observed, remembering her mentioning this hobby in one of her letters. "When I have time," Elara replied, following his gaze. "Sometimes I miss the simplicity of my old life, despite all the opportunities here." They faced each other across the small room, and Theodore felt all his carefully planned words deserting him. The months of separation collapsed into nothing, and he was once again the man who had fallen desperately in love with a baker's daughter who saw the world with clear eyes and an open heart. "Why did you come?" Elara asked gently, though her own emotions were clearly visible in her expression. Theodore told her about Isabel's pregnancy and the complications that threatened both mother and child. He explained his wife's surprising understanding and her suggestion that he seek the closure their interrupted love affair had never achieved. Throughout his explanation, Elara listened with the same focused attention she had always given him, her face reflecting both sympathy and sadness. "Your wife sounds like a remarkable woman," Elara said when he finished. "You're fortunate to have someone who understands that unresolved feelings can poison even the most well-intentioned relationships." "She is remarkable," Theodore agreed. "But she's not you." The simple statement hung between them, carrying all the weight of their shared history and impossible present circumstances. Elara moved to her easel and touched the edge of the unfinished painting, her fingers tracing the outline of Millhaven's harbor, where they had first acknowledged their love. "I've tried to forget you," she said quietly. "I've built this business, created opportunities for other women, established myself in ways I never imagined possible when I was just a baker's daughter in a small coastal town. I've had proposals from wealthy merchants and even minor nobles, but none of it fills the space you occupy in my heart." Theodore crossed the room and stood beside her, close enough to smell the familiar scent of flour and vanilla that always clung to her hair. "We can't change the circumstances that separate us," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "But we don't have to pretend that what we shared wasn't real." Elara turned to face him, tears glittering in her eyes. "What are you suggesting?" "I don't know," Theodore admitted. "I only know that I needed to see you again, to tell you that you'll always be the love of my life, regardless of what duty demands of both of us." They moved toward each other as if drawn by forces beyond their control, and when Theodore's arms closed around her, it felt like coming home after years of wandering in foreign territory. They held each other without speaking, memorizing the feeling of perfect completion that had been missing from both their lives. "This is dangerous," Elara whispered against his chest. "I know," Theodore replied, but neither of them stepped away. They spent the afternoon talking in ways they hadn't been able to communicate through letters. Theodore described the weight of kingship, the constant pressure of public scrutiny, and the loneliness of making decisions that affected thousands of lives. Elara shared her struggles with business expansion, her efforts to create opportunities for women in a male-dominated commercial world, and her own loneliness despite her material success. As evening approached, they both understood that their time together was drawing to a close. Theodore had responsibilities that would call him back to Valdoria, and Elara had a life and business that anchored her in Erinia. But something had shifted between them, a recognition that their love was not a weakness to be overcome, but a strength to be treasured, even if it could never be fully expressed. "I want to commission a portrait," Theodore said suddenly, as they prepared to part. "Nothing official or formal, just a painting that captures who you really are." Elara looked surprised. "Who would paint such a thing? And where could you possibly display it?" "There's an artist here in the capital who specializes in discreet commissions. Marcus investigated him thoroughly. He's talented and completely trustworthy. As for display, it would remain in my private study, where no one else would see it." "That seems like a form of torture," Elara said with concern. "Why would you want a constant reminder of what you can't have?" Theodore took her hands and looked directly into her eyes. "Because forgetting you would be a greater torture. This way, I can look at your face whenever I need to remember that true love is possible, even if circumstances don't allow it to flourish." After much hesitation, Elara agreed to sit for the portrait. The artist, a discreet professional named Henri who had painted several noble families, arranged private sessions in a studio. Over the course of a week, while Theodore conducted his trade negotiations, Elara spent her evenings posing for a painting that would capture her natural beauty and gentle spirit. Henri proved to be exactly the right artist for the commission. Rather than the formal poses typical of royal portraits, he painted Elara, as Theodore saw her, relaxed, genuine, with a slight smile that had first captured his heart, and eyes that reflected both intelligence and kindness. The finished portrait seemed to breathe with life, preserving not just Elara's physical appearance, but something essential about her character. Theodore's last evening in Erinia was spent alone with Elara in her private apartment above the bakery. They talked until dawn, sharing hopes and fears they had never confessed to anyone else. When the sun began to rise, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, they both knew their time had ended. "I'll always love you," Theodore said as they stood at her window, watching the city wake up below them. "And I'll always love you," Elara replied. "But we both have lives to live, responsibilities to honor. This week has been a gift, but it can't become a burden that prevents us from finding happiness in other ways." Theodore kissed her one final time, a gentle goodbye that acknowledged both the depth of their connection and the reality of their separation. Then he collected the carefully wrapped portrait and left Narinia, carrying with him renewed clarity about his duties as king and husband. When he returned to Valdoria, he found Isabel much improved. The crisis had passed, and the royal physicians were now optimistic about both her health and the baby's prospects. She greeted him with genuine relief and what seemed like deeper affection than she had ever shown before. "Did you find what you were looking for?" she asked privately that evening. "I found peace," Theodore replied honestly, "and a deeper appreciation for the life we're building together." It was true. Seeing Elara again had somehow freed him to invest more fully in his marriage to Isabel. He no longer felt guilty about his inability to love her passionately, because he now understood that their partnership had its own value and potential for growth. They might never share the consuming romantic love he had known with Elara, but they could build something meaningful based on mutual respect, shared purpose, and genuine care for each other's well-being. Theodore hung Elara's portrait in his private study, where it served exactly the purpose he had envisioned. Rather than tormenting him with impossible longing, it reminded him daily that he was capable of deep feeling and authentic connection. This knowledge made him a more compassionate king and a more attentive husband. 3 months later, Queen Isabel safely delivered a healthy son, Prince Alexander. Theodore felt a love for his child that was immediate and overwhelming, different from romantic love, but no less powerful. As he held his infant son, he realized that his heart was large enough to contain multiple forms of love without any of them diminishing the others. For 2 peaceful years, this arrangement worked beautifully. Theodore ruled wisely and fairly. His marriage to Isabel grew into genuine partnership and friendship, and Prince Alexander thrived as a happy, healthy child. The portrait in Theodore's study remained his secret, a private reminder of the road not taken that somehow made his chosen path more meaningful. But secrets, especially those involving the hearts of kings, have a way of revealing themselves at the most dangerous moments. The discovery happened on an autumn afternoon, when golden leaves drifted past the palace windows like scattered thoughts. Queen Isabel had been looking for a particular trade document that she remembered Theodore reviewing in his private study. Their relationship had evolved into such comfortable partnership that she no longer hesitated to enter his personal workspace when necessary, trusting in their mutual respect and shared responsibilities. Prince Alexander, now 2 years old, had been running through the corridors with his nursemaid in pursuit when he darted into his father's study ahead of his mother. The energetic toddler immediately began exploring with the fearless curiosity typical of his age, climbing onto chairs and reaching toward shelves that held fascinating objects just beyond his grasp. Isabel followed him into the room, smiling at her son's adventurous spirit while keeping a watchful eye on his activities. "Alexander, come away from there," she called gently as he attempted to reach a decorative box on Theodore's desk. In his eagerness, the child knocked over several items, including a small key that had been lying among Theodore's papers. As Isabel moved to prevent further chaos, the key skittered across the floor and came to rest near a section of wall paneling that looked slightly different from the rest. Her curiosity piqued by the key's obvious importance, she examined the wall more closely and discovered a hidden compartment that she had never known existed. The secret panel opened easily once she found the concealed mechanism, revealing a space just large enough to hold a single wrapped object. Isabel hesitated for a moment, understanding that she was about to cross a boundary in their marriage that had previously remained unexamined. But her practical nature overcame her hesitation, and she carefully removed the cloth-covered item from its hiding place. When she unwrapped Elara's portrait, Isabel felt as though the air had been knocked from her lungs. The painting was exquisite, capturing a woman of extraordinary beauty with such skill and obvious affection that its purpose was unmistakable. This was not a formal commission or casual artwork, but a deeply personal treasure that someone had taken great care to preserve and protect. Isabel sank into Theodore's chair, still holding the portrait while Prince Alexander continued his innocent exploration nearby. Her mind raced through conversations and memories, suddenly understanding subtle moments from their marriage in an entirely new light. Theodore's mysterious week-long trip to Narinia 3 years earlier, his occasional distant moods, the way his attention sometimes seemed focused on something far beyond their immediate circumstances. The woman in the portrait had auburn hair and green eyes that seemed to sparkle with intelligence and warmth. Her smile was natural and unguarded, the expression of someone who felt completely comfortable with the person viewing her. Most tellingly, she was painted not in the elaborate dress of nobility, but in simple, elegant clothing that suggested middle-class prosperity rather than aristocratic wealth. This was not a political alliance or a royal obligation. This was love. Isabel studied the painting for a long time, trying to reconcile the evidence before her with the man she thought she knew. Theodore had always been kind to her, respectful and attentive in their public appearances, and increasingly warm in their private interactions as their partnership had deepened. But she now realized that his emotional reserve, which she had attributed to royal dignity and the arranged nature of their marriage, might have had a much more specific cause. When Theodore returned to the palace that evening from a day of reviewing military preparations with the generals, he found Isabel waiting for him in their private sitting room with an expression he had never seen before. Prince Alexander was playing quietly with wooden toys near the fireplace, occasionally babbling to himself in the concentrated way of young children absorbed in their games. "We need to discuss something," Isabel said without preamble, her voice carefully controlled. Theodore immediately sensed the gravity of her mood and dismissed the servants who had been preparing their evening meal. When they were alone, except for their son, Isabel produced the portrait from behind her chair and placed it on the table between them. Theodore felt the world shift beneath him as he stared at Elara's painted face. The secret he had guarded so carefully for 5 years was suddenly exposed, vulnerable to interpretation and judgment. His first instinct was to deny or explain away what Isabel had found, but the direct honesty in his wife's eyes demanded the same truthfulness he had always tried to maintain in their relationship. "Her name is Elara Winters," he said quietly. "I met her before our marriage, before I was king. The portrait was commissioned during my trade mission to Narinia." "You're in love with her," Isabel stated, her voice surprisingly steady. "Yes," Theodore replied, seeing no point in further deception. "I have been since the first day we met." Isabel absorbed this confirmation with visible effort, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Prince Alexander looked up from his toys, sensing the tension in the room with the intuitive awareness children often possess, but both parents managed to maintain calm exteriors that kept him from becoming distressed. "Tell me about her," Isabel said after a long silence. Theodore hesitated, uncertain whether sharing details would make the situation better or worse. But Isabel's direct gaze indicated that half-truths would no longer suffice. So he told her everything about meeting Elara in Millhaven during the storm relief efforts, their correspondence over nearly 2 years, the painful goodbye when duty demanded their separation, and the week in Narinia when he had commissioned the portrait. Throughout his explanation, Isabel listened with the same focused attention she brought to matters of state, occasionally asking questions for clarification, but showing no emotional reaction beyond a slight tightening around her eyes. When Theodore finished, they sat in silence while Prince Alexander continued playing, blissfully unaware that his parents' marriage was being redefined in the space of a single conversation. "I understand why you fell in love with her," Isabel said finally. "From her description, she sounds like exactly the kind of woman who would capture your heart completely." "Isabel, I want you to know that I've never been unfaithful to me," she interrupted. "I know that. Whatever else might be said about this situation, I've never doubted your honor or integrity." Theodore felt a rush of gratitude for her understanding, but also a deepening sense of guilt about the pain his secret had obviously caused. "I never intended for you to discover this. The portrait was meant to be a private reminder, nothing more." Isabel picked up the painting and studied it more closely, her expression thoughtful rather than angry. "She's beautiful, but it's more than that, isn't it? There's something in her face that suggests she sees the world differently than most people. She does, Theodore confirmed. She has a way of finding hope and possibility in circumstances that would discourage others. When I was with her, I felt like the man I had always hoped to become. And with me? The question hung between them, dangerous and necessary. Theodore chose his words carefully, knowing that his answer would shape their future together. With you, I feel like the king I need to be. You make me wiser, more thoughtful, more aware of the broader implications of my decisions. Our partnership has made me a better ruler and, I believe, a better man. Isabel seemed to consider this distinction, weighing the difference between romantic fulfillment and practical partnership. But you'll never love me the way you love her. No, Theodore admitted, the honesty painful but necessary. But I've come to value what we have created together in ways I never expected when our marriage was first arranged. Prince Alexander chose that moment to approach his parents with a wooden horse, babbling excitedly about some imaginary adventure. Theodore lifted his son onto his lap, and Isabel watched their interaction with new eyes, seeing perhaps the genuine affection that had grown between them even in the absence of passionate romance. "What happens now?" she asked when Alexander had returned to his toys. "I don't know," Theodore replied honestly. "I suppose that depends on what you want to happen." Isabel stood and walked to the window, staring out at the palace gardens where servants were lighting torches against the approaching darkness. "I've been thinking about our conversation 3 years ago when I suggested you go to Narinia. I thought that seeing her again would help you find closure and allow you to invest more fully in our marriage. It did in many ways, but it also led to this portrait, which suggests that closure wasn't exactly what you found." Theodore couldn't deny the accuracy of her observation. Commissioning Elara's portrait had been an act of preservation rather than farewell, a way of keeping their love alive in secret rather than truly letting it go. "I need time to think about this," Isabel continued, "about what it means for our marriage, our son, our kingdoms. This isn't just a personal matter. There are political implications to consider as well." Theodore understood the complexity of their situation. In their world, royal marriages served multiple purposes beyond personal happiness, and any threat to the stability of their union could have far-reaching consequences for both Valdoria and Narinia. "Of course," he agreed. "Take whatever time you need." Over the following weeks, an unusual tension settled over the royal household. Theodore and Isabel continued their public duties with perfect composure, but their private interactions became carefully formal, as though they were diplomats negotiating a delicate treaty rather than spouses sharing a life. Isabel spent hours in her private chambers, sometimes writing letters that she never sent, other times staring at books without reading them. Theodore found himself avoiding his study entirely, unable to bear the space where his secret had been discovered and where Elara's portrait had been kept for so long. The breaking point came when news arrived from Narinia that would change everything. A messenger brought word that Elara's business had suffered a devastating fire that destroyed not only her primary bakery, but also the school she had established for merchants' daughters. While no lives had been lost, years of work had been reduced to ashes, and many women who had depended on her enterprises for their livelihoods were now without employment. Theodore read the report with growing distress, his concern for Elara's welfare overwhelming his attempts to maintain emotional distance. The practical side of his mind understood that this was an opportunity to help rebuild important infrastructure that benefited both kingdoms. But his heart knew that his real motivation was simpler and more dangerous. That evening, he approached Isabel with a proposal that he knew would test their marriage beyond anything they had yet faced. "I want to provide aid for the rebuilding efforts in Narinia," he said without preamble as they sat in their private sitting room. Isabel looked up from her needlework with an expression that suggested she had been expecting this conversation. "Official crown aid or personal assistance?" "Both," Theodore replied honestly. "The fire destroyed infrastructure that serves both kingdoms, so there's legitimate governmental interest in restoration. But I also want to ensure that Elara specifically has the resources to rebuild everything she lost." "You want to go there personally?" Isabel observed. Yes. They stared at each other across the room, both understanding that this decision would define the future of their relationship. Isabel set down her needlework and folded her hands in her lap, her expression thoughtful but unreadable. If you go to her now, when she's vulnerable and in need of help, what happens then? She asked quietly. I don't know, Theodore admitted. I only know that I can't sit here safely in my palace while she struggles to rebuild her life. Even though helping her might destroy everything we've built together, the question struck at the heart of Theodore's dilemma. His marriage to Isabel had become something valuable and meaningful, even without romantic love. Their partnership served their kingdoms well, provided stability for their son, and had grown into genuine friendship and mutual respect. Risking all of that to help a woman he could never truly be with seemed both selfless and selfish simultaneously. I don't want to destroy what we have, Theodore said carefully. But I can't abandon her when she needs help. Isabel stood and walked to her jewelry box, removing something that she had apparently placed there recently. When she turned around, Theodore saw that she held Elara's portrait, which she had kept in her possession since discovering it weeks earlier. I've been studying this painting, she said, approaching Theodore with the artwork in her hands. Trying to understand what I see in her face that has captured your heart so completely. Theodore accepted the portrait, his hands trembling slightly as he looked once again at Elara's painted features. And what did you conclude? That she's exactly the kind of woman you would love, Isabel replied with surprising gentleness. Someone who sees possibility instead of obstacles, who builds rather than simply inherits, who treats people as individuals rather than ranks or titles. Isabel, I also realize that I've been approaching this situation entirely wrong, she continued, her voice growing stronger. I've been thinking of her as a threat to our marriage, but perhaps she's actually the key to making it something more honest and sustainable. Theodore stared at his wife in confusion, uncertain where her logic was leading. Isabel returned to her chair and leaned forward slightly, her expression intense and determined. What if we stop pretending that royal marriages can't accommodate different kinds of love? She asked. What if we acknowledge that you and I have built something valuable that doesn't depend on romantic passion, while also recognizing that your feelings for Elara are equally real and valid? What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that you go to Narinia, help Elara rebuild, and stop torturing yourself with guilt about loving her. Our marriage serves important purposes that have nothing to do with whether you love someone else. Perhaps it's time to stop demanding that it be something it was never meant to be. Theodore felt as though the ground had shifted beneath him once again. He had expected anger, demands for choosing between his wife and his lost love, possibly even dissolution of their marriage. Instead, Isabel seemed to be offering a radical reimagining of what their relationship could become. And you would be comfortable with such an arrangement? Isabel smiled for the first time in weeks, an expression that seemed both sad and relieved. I would be more comfortable with honest complexity than with continued pretense. You've been a good husband and an excellent king, Theodore. The fact that your heart belongs elsewhere doesn't diminish the value of what we've accomplished together. But what about appearances, political stability, the example we set for other royal marriages? We maintain our public partnership exactly as we always have, Isabel replied practically. Nothing changes in terms of our official duties or our commitment to each other and to our son. We simply stop expecting our private feelings to conform to public necessities. It was a sophisticated solution that acknowledged the realities of arranged marriages while allowing space for human emotion and authentic relationships. Theodore felt both grateful for Isabel's understanding and terrified of the implications of accepting her offer. There would be risks, he said slowly, if knowledge of such an arrangement became public. Then we would face those consequences together, as we've faced everything else, Isabel replied firmly. But I believe the greater risk lies in continuing to deny truths that are already shaping our choices. That night, Theodore lay awake thinking about the extraordinary conversation with his wife and the possibilities she had opened. By morning, he had made his decision, one that would require courage, discretion, and a redefinition of everything he had believed about duty and love.